Now we come to Sutta number 8, Mahasihanada Sutta, the Great Lion's Roar. So it's a bit long. Thus have I heard. Once the Lord was staying at Ujjunyaya in the deer park of Kanakatale. There the naked ascetic Kassapa came to him, exchanged courtesies with him and stood to one side. Then he said, Friend Gotama or Samana Gotama, I have heard it said, the ascetic Gotama disapproves of all austerities and censures and blames all those who lead a harsh life of self-mortification. Now are those who say this telling the truth, or do they not slander the Lord Buddha with Lord Gotama with lies? Do they explain the truth about his Dhamma and what pertains to it? Or does some fellow teacher of a different sect deserve to be blamed for this statement? We would like to see the Lord Gotama refute this charge. And the Buddha said, Kassapa, those who say this are not telling the truth. They slander me with lies. The situation occurs, Kassapa, that I see one practicer of mortification, that means torturing oneself, and with the divine eye which is purified beyond the sight of humans, I see him arising after death, at the breaking up of the body, in a place of woe, a baleful place, a place of destruction in hell. Again I see one practicer of mortification, arising after death, in a good place, a heavenly state. Again I see one who practices little austerity, arising in a state of woe. Again I see one who practices little austerity, arising after death, in a good place, a heavenly state. Since I can see as it is the arising, the destiny, the death, and re-arising of those ascetics, how could I disapprove of all austerities and censure and blame all those who lead a harsh life of self-mortification? Stop here for a moment. So here, this naked ascetic, Kassapa, is asking the Buddha that some people say the Buddha disapproves of all ascetic practices, all austerities. The Buddha said that is not true. The Buddha said because he has seen some people practice a lot of austerities, they go to hell. But on the other hand, there are some people practice a lot of austerities and they go to heaven. Again, he has seen some people practice little austerities, go to hell. And some practice little austerities, go to heaven. So he does not generalize just by practicing austerities. It's no good. Just by practicing austerities, you go to woeful planes of rebirth. The Buddha never says this. The Buddha is trying to say. So in some other suttas, the Buddha says that whether you should practice something or not, the Buddha says if you practice something and it does not harm others, it does not harm yourself, then you can practice it. But if it harms others or harms yourself, you should not. So that is one criterion. Another criterion, the Buddha said, if you practice something, it leads to an increase in unwholesome states, or a decrease in wholesome states, then you should not practice it. But if you practice something and it leads to an increase in wholesome states, or a decrease in unwholesome states, then you should practice it. So the Buddha himself has practiced all sorts of austerities before he became enlightened. He practiced so much, he suffered so much. The Buddha said, you cannot find another ascetic who suffered more than him on the spiritual path. Either the past ascetics or present ascetics or future ascetics. Nobody suffered more than him on the spiritual path, the Buddha said. At the most, the Buddha said, they only equal him. He cannot have suffered more than him. That is the Bodhisattva. And nowadays, people say the Bodhisattva is just making vows. So easy, making vows and burning your hand and all that. And the Buddha, the real Bodhisattva, like the Buddha, he went through all the ascetic practices. So the Buddha, having realized it, then he found that certain ascetic practices which are beneficial, we should practice. Those that are not beneficial, for example, in India, there's some they hold up their hands for 1 year, for 5 years, for 10 years, for 20 years, and hold their hand until the hand cannot come down. For what? Doesn't benefit anybody. But the Buddha, ascetic practice, he eats 1 meal a day. To a lot of people, that is very ascetic. A lot of people prefer to eat 4 meals or 5 meals a day. Xiu Ye and all that. But Buddha only eats 1 meal a day. So To some people that is very ascetic, but to him he doesn't consider that to be ascetic. He thinks that is ideal. Eating one meal a day, he doesn't become too fat, doesn't become too sleepy. But some people find it difficult. So nowadays a lot of monks take 2 meals. That the Buddha allowed also later. Not all ascetic practices the Buddha condemned. Those that are beneficial, the Buddha encouraged. For example, begging for food, encourage monks to beg for their food. A lot of monks don't beg for their food. They think that is an ascetic practice. But the Buddha thinks it's very good. Why? Because it helps to cut our ego. When you beg for your food, you cannot be proud. You have to depend on people for your food. So, the Buddha's austerities are only those that are beneficial. And the Buddha said, Kassapa, there are some ascetics and Brahmins who are wise, skilled, practice in disputation, splitters of hairs, acute, who walk cleverly along the paths of views. Sometimes their views accord with mine, sometimes they do not. What they sometimes applaud, we sometimes applaud. What they sometimes do not applaud, we sometimes do not applaud. What they sometimes applaud, we sometimes do not applaud. And what they sometimes do not applaud, we sometimes applaud. What we sometimes applaud, they sometimes applaud. What we sometimes do not applaud, they sometimes do not applaud. What we sometimes applaud, they sometimes do not applaud. And what we sometimes do not applaud, they sometimes applaud. On approaching them, I say, in these things there is no agreement. Let us leave them aside. In these things there is agreement. There let the wise take up, cross-question and criticize these matters with the teachers or with their followers, saying, of these things that are unskillful and reckoned as such censurable, to be refrained from, unbefitting a noble one, black, and reckoned as such, who is there who has completely abandoned such things and is free from them? The ascetic Gotama or some other venerable teachers. It may be that the wise say, of those things that are unskilled, the ascetic Gotama has completely freed himself, but the other reverend teachers only in part. In this case, the wise give us the greatest share of praise. Or the wise may say, of those things that are skilled and reckoned as such, blameless, to be practiced, fitting for a noble one, bright and reckoned as such, who is there who has completely mastered them? The ascetic Gotama or some other reverend teachers. Or the wise may say, of these things the ascetic Gotama has completely mastered them, but the other reverend teachers only in part. In this case, the wise give us the greatest share of praise. The order of the ascetic Gotama's disciples, or that of reverend teachers. So, here the Buddha is saying, when they compare him with other external sect teachers, or they compare his disciples with the disciples of other external sect teachers, then the Buddha and his disciples get the greatest share of the praise, more praise than the external sect ascetics. Kassapa, there is a path, there is a course of training, whereby one who has followed it will know and see for himself. The ascetic Gotama speaks at the proper time. What is true, to the point, the Dhammavinaya. What is this path and this course of training? It is the Noble Eightfold Path, namely right view, right thought, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. This is the path whereby one may know and see for oneself. The ascetic Gotama speaks at the proper time. What is true, to the point, the Dhammavinaya. At this, Kassapa said to the Lord, Gotama, these ascetic practices of certain practices of self-mortification are considered proper to them. A naked ascetic uses no polite restraints, licks his hands, does not come or stand still when requested. He does not accept food offered or prepared for him, or an invitation to a meal. He does not accept food out of the pot or pan, nor on the threshold, among the firewood or the rice pounders, nor where two people are eating, from a pregnant or nursing woman, or from one living with a man, nor from gleanings, from where a dog is standing, or where flies are swarming. He eats no fish or meat, and drinks no rum or spirits or fermented rice gruel. He is a one-house man or a one-piece man, a two-house man, up to a seven-piece man or a seven-house man. He exists on 1, 2, or up to 7 little offerings, eats only once a day, once in 2 days, once in 7 days. He takes to eating rice only twice a month. That means once in 2 weeks. These are considered proper practices. Stop here for a moment. So here, this Kassapa, being a naked ascetic, one who practices these ascetic practices, he's trying to tell the Buddha that all these practices are good. These austerities practiced by naked ascetics. For example, he's a naked ascetic uses no polite restraints. When people ask him to come, he refuses to come. Ask him to stand still, he refuses to stand still. Invite him to a meal, he does not. Wants to be very heroic, macho. Then also he has this sense of compassion, which is not tempered with wisdom. For example, if a woman is nursing a baby or pregnant and wants to give him food, he thinks, if I take the food, then the baby will not have enough to eat. Then he refuses to take. Or if somebody offers him the food, then there are some dogs standing there. Then he thinks, if I take the food, then the dogs won't have enough to eat. Then he won't accept. Or somebody gives him food, then he sees a lot of flies. Then he thinks, if I take all this food, then the flies will have less food to eat. Then he won't accept. And then here, see, he eats no fish or meat. This vegetarian practice also is an external sect practice, not the Buddha's practice. A lot of people think, in Chinese we say, Sir Chai. Sir Chai and Sir Su is completely different. Sir Chai is the Buddhist practice. Sir Chai is the Pakwan Chai. That means we don't eat afternoon. After the sun, the highest, until the next dawn, we don't eat. That is Sir Chai. Sir Su is a Taoist practice. Sir Su is vegetarian practice. It's not a Buddhist practice. But this Taoist practice crept into Buddhism in China because the emperor Liang Wuti, in the year 511, he commanded that all Buddhist monks and nuns must become vegetarians, just like Taoist priests. So, but all the time, the people know that the Buddhist monks and nuns are Sir Chai. So, when they start to Sir Su, eat vegetarian food, they still call them Sir Chai. So that's why there's this confusion in China between Sir Chai and Sir Su. That means not eating afternoon and vegetarian practice. So you see here, external ascetics, they don't eat fish, they don't eat meat. And also this, he begs for his food from one house, from 2 houses, up to a maximum of 7 houses. And this has crept into Mahayana Buddhism. They say in Mahayana Buddhism, when you beg for your food, you must not beg more than 7 houses. But in Theravada, original Buddhism, you can beg as many houses as you like until you get enough food. Okay. Or a man becomes this, further the description of the ascetic practices. Or a man becomes a herb eater, a millet eater, a raw rice eater, a wild rice eater, an eater of water plants, of rice husk powder, of rice scum, of the flowers of all seeds, grass or cow dung, of forest roots and fruits, eating windfalls. He wears coarse hemp or mixed material, shrouds from corpses, rags from the dust heap, garments of bark fiber, antelope skins, grass, bark, shavings, blankets of human hair or horse hair, the wings of owls. He is a plucker out of hair and beard, devoted to this practice. He is a covered thorn man, making his bed on them, sleeping alone in a garment of wet mud, living in the open air, accepting whatever seed is offered, living on filth and addicted to the practice. One who drinks no water and is addicted to the practice, or he dwells intent on the practice of going to bed 3 times before evening. Stop here for a moment. I see here, living on filth, on shit. The Buddha also practiced. At one time, the Buddha said he was eating cow shit. You follow the cows. You eat dry cow dung. You eat wet cow dung. and eventually he even ate his own shit. Kassapa, a practicer of self-mortification, may do all these things, but if his morality and his mind and his wisdom are not developed and brought to realization, then indeed he is still far from being a samana or a brahmana. Stop here for a moment. During the Buddha's days, renunciants were either called samana or brahmana. If they came from the Brahmin caste, they are called brahmana. If they came from the other three castes, they are called samana. The other three castes meaning the Khattiya caste, the warrior caste, or the merchant class, or the worker class. But Kassapa, when a monk develops non-enmity, non-ill will, and a heart full of loving kindness, and abandoning the asavas, realizes and dwells in the uncorrupted deliverance by mind, the deliverance by wisdom, having realized it in this very life by his own insight, then Kassapa, that monk is termed a samana and a brahmana. At this, Kassapa said to the Lord, Reverend Gautama, it is hard to be a samana, it is hard to be a brahmana. Stop here for a moment. So when the Buddha says that a real samana or a real brahmana is one who has developed his sila, his moral conduct, developed his mind, and developed his wisdom, and then to the extent of attaining a liberation by mind or liberation by wisdom, that is a real samana and a brahmana. And then this Kassapa, having heard that, he said, that is very difficult to become a samana or a brahmana. And the Buddha said, so they say in the world, Kassapa, it is hard to be a samana, it is hard to be a brahmana. If a naked ascetic were to do all these things as before, and if this were the measure and practice of the difficulty, the great difficulty of being a samana or brahmana, it would not be right to say it is hard to be a samana, it is hard to be a brahmana, because any householder or householder's son, even the slave girl who draws water, could do this by saying, I will go naked, etc. But Kassapa, because there is a very different kind of asceticism besides this, therefore it is right to say it is hard to be a samana, it is hard to be a brahmana. But Kassapa, when a monk develops non-enmity, non-ill will, and a heart full of loving kindness, and abandoning the asavas, realizes and dwells in the uncorrupted liberation by mind and liberation by wisdom, having realized it in this very life by his own insight, then that monk is called a samana and a brahmana. Stop here for a moment. So, the Buddha is saying, if you think the practice of the ascetics, the naked ascetics, as stated before, going naked and begging for their food, but not accepting if there are flies, if there are dogs, and when somebody asks you to come, you don't want to come, asks you to stand still, you don't want to stand still. The Buddha said, this is not difficult. Anyone can do, even a slave girl also can do. But to develop your moral conduct, your mind, your wisdom, and attain enlightenment, that is really hard to do. At this, Kassapa said to the Lord, Reverend Gautama, it is hard to understand a samana, it is hard to understand a brahmana. And the Buddha said, so they say in the world, Kassapa, it is hard to understand a samana, it is hard to understand a brahmana. If a naked ascetic were to do all these things, and if this were the measure and practice of the difficulty, the great difficulty of understanding a samana or brahmana, it would not be right to say that because any householder son or any householder's or even a slave girl could understand what it means to go naked, what it means to beg for your food, what it means not to stand still when people ask you to stand still, etc. But Kassapa, because there is a very different kind of Samanism and Brahmanism beside this, it is right to say it is hard to understand a Samana or a Brahmana. But Kassapa, when a monk develops non-enmity, non-ill will, and a heart full of loving kindness, and abandoning the asavas, realizes and dwells in the uncorrupted liberation by mind, the liberation by wisdom, having realized it in this very life by his own insight, then Kassapa, that monk is called a samana and a brahmana. Then Kassapa said to the Lord, Reverend Gautama, what then is the development of morality, of the mind and of wisdom? So here, after the Buddha explains to him that the real practice of a samana and a brahmana is to get rid of ill will, to get rid of enmity, and to develop loving kindness and abandon the asavas and attain enlightenment. Then he asked the Buddha to explain how to practice all of this. Then the Buddha said, Kassapa, a Tathagata arises in the world, an Arahant, Sammasambuddha, endowed with wisdom and conduct, well-farer, knower of the worlds, incomparable trainer of men to be tamed, teacher of gods and humans, enlightened and blessed. He, having realized it by his own super-knowledge, proclaims this world with its devas, maras and brahmas, its princes and people. He preaches the Dhamma, which is lovely in its beginning, lovely in its middle, lovely in its ending, in the spirit and in the letter, and displays the fully perfected and purified holy life. A disciple goes forth and practices the moralities. That is the perfection of morality. He guards the sense doors, etc., etc., and attains the 4 jhanas. That is the perfection of the mind. He attains various insights and the cessation of the corruptions. That is the perfection of wisdom. And Kassapa, there is nothing further or more perfect than this perfection of morality, of the mind and of wisdom. Stop here for a moment. So you see the Buddha's Sammasambuddha. Before I came to Buddhism, I was studying Hinduism for 4 years. And I found some of these Hindu saints are very inspiring. But what I noticed when I came to Buddhism was the Sammasambuddha's explanation is so detailed, so clear compared to the other sages. So you see here, when the Kassapa asked him to explain the development of morality, of the mind and of wisdom, the Buddha explains it so clearly. Development of morality, all those moral practices that we went through in Sutta Majjhima Nikaya number 2, the verses 41 to 63. If you recall, the Buddha is talking about the 7 precepts, the 10 precepts, not to practice the shaman practices, not to make predictions, all the different types of wrong livelihood, not to do that. That is the perfection of morality. And then the perfection of the mind is the charana, the practice, the other practices under charana after the 4 jhanas, practicing mindfulness and sati sampajanya, contentment, and all that, and finally attaining the 4 jhanas, culminating in the 4 jhanas. When a person attains the 4 jhanas, and the mind is fully developed, that is called the perfection of the mind. And then after that, he uses the having attained the 4 jhanas, the Buddha says the mind is malleable, pliant and wieldy. He can use it to attain the various insights. So when he directs it to the various insights, then he gets the various insights under Vijja, which we went through in Sutta number 2. The various psychic powers, finally the destruction of the asavas, meaning liberation, and that is the perfection of wisdom. When a person becomes fully liberated, here sometimes the Buddha calls it liberation by mind, liberation by wisdom, and that is the perfection of wisdom. There is nothing more perfect than this perfection of morality, of the mind and of wisdom. Kassapa, there are some ascetics and Brahmins who preach morality. They praise morality in various ways. But as regards the highest Aryan morality, Kassapa, I do not see any who have surpassed me in this. I am supreme in this regard, in super morality. There are some ascetics and Brahmins who preach self-mortification and scrupulous austerity, which they praise in various ways. But as regards the highest Aryan self-mortification and austerity, Kassapa, I do not see any who have surpassed me in this. I am supreme in this regard, in super austerity. There are some ascetics and Brahmins who preach wisdom. They praise wisdom in various ways. But as regards the highest Aryan wisdom, Kassapa, I do not see any who have surpassed me in this. I am supreme in this regard, in super wisdom. There are some ascetics and Brahmins who preach liberation. They praise liberation in various ways. But as regards the highest Aryan liberation, Kassapa, I do not see any who have surpassed me in this. I am supreme in this regard, in super liberation. Stop here for a moment. So here the Buddha is saying there are other ascetics, external ascetics, who say they also practice the highest morality. But as far as the Aryan morality means the morality of an Aryan, the type of morality you practice, where you can become an Aryan. The Buddha says he is the highest. And then the same with this Aryan self-mortification and austerity. As I mentioned before, Aryan austerity means the austerity practiced by Aryans which are beneficial, which will help you to attain enlightenment, not those that are unbeneficial. In that regard, the Buddha says he has the highest austerity, Aryan austerity. And also similarly with regard to Aryan wisdom and liberation.